Welcome back to One on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show. We're pleased to be joined by Pat O'Keefe of News 12, the Bronx and Brooklyn. He is the sports director there and a news anchor. And Pat, I want to start with very recent news. I understand yesterday you were at the funeral of Brandon Hendricks, and we wanted to discuss this story, the 17-year-old who was shot. And you called this experience heart-wrenching. I understand that he was a basketball star and potentially on his way to St. John's University. If you could give us a little information on your coverage here, being at such a difficult moment, seeing the community come together. I know you had the chance to speak to some of his teammates and friends. And how did they remember Brandon? And what can you tell us about this young man?
We know what's going on in New York City right now with all the gun violence, especially in the last 2 to 3 weeks. It's obviously getting out of control and something needs to be done. This is different from what we've experienced, just in the fact that it seems like from all of my reporting and everybody I've spoken to about Brandon Hendricks Ellison, this just was a good kid who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you're at the wrong place for a specific reason. That wasn't the case here. This was a kid who had a goal to play Division I college basketball. He was a very good high school player. He was probably going to go the JUCO route, but from his head coach at Monroe High School, Nigel Thompson, who's been a coach in the PSAL for a very long time, and he's a man whose opinion I trust, and he's not going to say something just because a certain player played for him. But Brandon was on track to be a Division I basketball player. He got his grades up. He needed to get them above an 85 average. He would give you, according to his teammates, the last dollar in his pocket, the shirt off his back. I mean, he was just a good kid. We've seen the pictures of him. Actually, I'll hold it up. This is from the memorial service yesterday. But the thing you see with Brandon, every picture, unless he was on the court and it's a picture of him in an action shot, but it's that smile. He had that smile that lit up a room. And look, this is unfortunately in my 13 years at News 12, I would say I've covered upwards of 10 to 12 active high school athletes who died as teenagers. This is something that for a number of reasons: carbon monoxide poisoning, hit by a train, shootings, stabbings. Unfortunately, this is a story that I've seen far too often. This seems different because it's involving something that's so prevalent in our society right now, but it's not the typical case. This was the wrong place at the wrong time. And I felt so bad. I felt so bad for everybody who was there. Yes, they're still in shock. I mean, it's not even 3 weeks ago. They don't know what happened. I'm not saying that anybody deserves to go out this way. We've seen people go out this way. This is definitely not somebody who was asking for trouble. And that's the thing that I think everybody's just having trouble wrapping their heads around right now.
And seeing the community reel on other levels too in the past many months with the coronavirus, and there have been widespread protests in the Bronx and Brooklyn, and we've seen civil unrest and we've seen a pandemic. These are unrelated things, but nonetheless both very affecting to these communities. Being on the front lines and covering these things as a reporter, what have you learned about these communities and their resiliency and just observing the challenges that they've faced in the last many months?
Personally, I've learned a lot during this, especially, well, personally and professionally, I've learned a lot. I'll speak professionally quickly because it's what I've learned personally that I want to focus on. Professionally, I've had to learn a lot for the last 3.5 months because I do a sportscast every night and there hasn't been any sports. And right. I've had to go back to and you guys are continuing to do your show. Like we're all there right now, right? I've had to go back to my roots, and really dig in and find those interesting stories and find those human interest stories and find different angles of this coronavirus pandemic and how it's affecting different types of athletes and different types of people in the sports world. Personally, from the protests, from the Black Lives Matter movement, I've learned a tremendous amount. I've learned that just doing the right thing and feeling the right way about things and being on the right side of, I mean, look, Black Lives Matter. There's no wrong side of that, right? There's only one side as far as I'm concerned. But just feeling that way and realizing that is not enough. And you know what? And I've said this to a lot of coaches, black athletes who I cover. I've had a lot of conversations with them over the last month and a half. I've sat down, not with them, virtually, like we're doing now. I've sat down with coaches, respected men in the community, former college basketball players, current high school basketball coaches, leaders of young Black men in our communities. And I said, I don't know what it's like, to be a Black man in the street. Like, educate me. What are you feeling in these certain situations? And this is also heart-wrenching because the stories that these young kids tell me, and then that these coaches tell me of things they have to experience that I never have to experience. And I have a 6-year-old son, and he doesn't have to experience those types of things. But as a father, I can relate to what, for example, these coaches are going through, who have players and who have children that society looks at them, treats them differently. Just because I don't and haven't is not good enough anymore. So, people like me, people who are not being directly affected by this, obviously have to do more. That's been my biggest takeaway during this, just listening and having these conversations and really becoming, not that I wouldn't say I wasn't educated. And I think a lot of people would say this, it didn't affect me, the Black Lives Matter movement. I obviously, was always on the right side of this. That's good enough. That's kind of how I felt. And that's not good enough anymore. It's gone on too long and it's not good enough. And that's been my biggest takeaway. And it's really been a learning experience.
Yeah. And Pat, sticking with this subject of Black Lives Matter, we've seen so many prominent Black athletes outspoken, protesting, out there in the forefront, trying to get the message spread to everybody. And I want to talk about the high school athletes, particularly because we saw McCord Maker, a top 5 consensus recruit. He ended up going to Howard. He's committed there to an historically Black college. And now there are others. We spoke about Mikey Williams and countless others who are now starting to think about, hey, going to an HBCU to play college basketball there. What do you think about this younger generation and now these high school recruits, a lot of prominent ones, deciding that, hey, maybe an HBCU is the route that I want to go to as far as college athletics is concerned?
And we just ran a story on this, our reporter Greg Thompson on News 12 over the weekend, and he spoke with a lot of prominent recruits from New York City, from Boys and Girls High School, from Brooklyn Collegiate, some of the top high school players in the city who are not yet committed, and they're now looking at this in a different light as well, saying that, and you know what, you needed that one guy to kind of lead the way, and we have that now. And Mikey Williams has been the guy who we've talked about and heard his name, and we'll still see how that goes, but it doesn't have to be just one or two guys. The guys that we've spoken to in New York City, not the top prospects nationally, but they're college basketball prospects. They're guys who also, in their own right, would never have considered going to these schools before. And now they're on their radar as well. And they're not just looking at it as like, oh, maybe it's a nice thing to do. It's more than that now. It's a political statement in many ways. It's trying to help out their own community in many ways. And I'll be very curious to see how this goes. If we can push through just the one big name recruit, and if we can get others to follow.
I want to transition to the pros, and finally there maybe is some substance for us to talk about as baseball looks to gear up. And I know you were at both Citi Field and Yankee Stadium, getting to take a look at those ballparks in rare form that we never have seen them. What were your impressions from such an unprecedented summer camp? These two teams will play on Saturday in exhibition. How do you think this season is going to look for the rest of us when it comes just from your first look?
Well, it looked, and I've been to spring trainings before, it looked like spring training. They're not, it's 60, 75% effort. They're just getting loose. They're just getting their legs back under them, et cetera. Being there was surreal. Covering a baseball practice. First of all, there's not that many baseball practices at Yankee Stadium or Citi Field during the year. Really, the only times I can remember being at one of those stadiums for a workout was either before opening day or before a playoff series. Other than that,
Right.
you're never there in the middle of, in the middle of July as we were last week. So that was kind of surreal. Having the run of Yankee Stadium, so to speak. Not that we had the run of it, but we had our whole section to ourselves. We could bounce around and shoot different elements of video and gather different shots for our coverage. That was a unique experience for us. On the field, it reminded me a lot of what a spring training would look like. I still think that we're 40. Saturday is the first game. 48 hours from when we're speaking right now. Saturday is the
Right.
first Yankees-Mets exhibition game. There's a long way to go between now and July 23rd when Yankees and Nationals are supposed to open the season. I think it's a good sign that they've kind of like plowed through. Everybody always wondered, wow, first big name gets the coronavirus, the whole sport's going to shut down. Well, all the sports have proven that that's not going to be the case. Russell Westbrook has it. Aroldis Chapman has it. DJ LeMahieu has it. There's big names now that have it. And the concern that remains is what happens if half a team gets it and one team gets wiped
Right.
out. But they've shown that they're going to push right through no matter how big. And those are some big names I just mentioned. All stars, top players, different sports. These sports have shown, which they needed to, that they're going to, be able to withstand the one-off test, no matter how prominent the player is. But the concern that still remains is what happens if half a team is wiped out.
Yeah, and Pat, we speak about the coronavirus being the main threat to players, but playing a condensed 60-game schedule, attrition really plays a factor. And focusing on the New York Mets, Jacob deGrom had some back issues, was complaining of a sore back. An MRI recently came back clean. But for the New York Mets, who already are going to be without Noah Syndergaard, with Tommy John, for this team that really makes its money in its starting rotation, how imperative is it for them to maybe monitor Jacob deGrom and kind of take it easy? And how realistic is it knowing that you only have 60 games in a season?
Well, he's your most valuable asset, so you have to monitor him. You can't go – look, I expect big things from the Mets, even without Syndergaard, assuming deGrom's health, of course. I think they have the pieces in place to absolutely be a factor for a National League pennant this year. deGrom is the best pitcher in baseball. The Mets have among the best staffs in baseball. And the one thing I haven't seen from the Mets really since 2015 is I haven't seen the entire lineup clicking at the same time. But there's some names in there, and there's some guys in that lineup that if they can all somehow click at the same time, can also be a very effective lineup. That said, deGrom is for the next 5 years, and I'm including Pete Alonso here as much as I love Pete, but deGrom is the only guy in the Mets who can say he's the best at what he does in the entire sport. They have to protect him at all costs, even if it means not getting to where they want to get this season.
And talk about that lineup, it may even be more powerful than the pitching rotation, being that the Mets have lost Wheeler and Syndergaard will be down. I want to move to the NCAA, and I know you covered the Fordham football announcement, the Patriot League canceling the fall season and all fall athletics, the Big East today announcing that they will not play non-conference games, but they're going to try to stage a conference season along with a number of other conferences that have announced that. What was some of your insights from your conversations with, I know you spoke with the athletic director and the head coach, Joe Conlon. What is your guess on the potential that football could be played in the spring?
I think it could, because the Patriot League, much like the Ivy League, it's a different level than the other conferences in college in many ways, as we know. It's a different student athlete that's participating in those sports, in those conferences. There's not a ton of there is some, as we know. I mean, there's a handful of Fordham guys and Patriot League guys in the NFL, even in the NBA, Patriot League players. But the professional leagues are not sitting back and relying on the talent coming out of these conferences. So as far as getting ready for the combine or getting up to snuff for next NFL season, there's not going to be a huge trickle-down effect if it's those two conferences. So they can definitely – the nice thing about the Ivy League, they were the model. They are the model. And then the Patriot League, starting in the 90s, kind of used that model, veered off a little bit. But for a lot of similarities, each of those conferences can absolutely function in a bubble. If the health is there, if the health concerns are not in the spring what they are right now, and nobody knows if that's going to be the case, we can only hope and pray, then I definitely think they can make that happen. Talking with Ed Cull, my biggest question was, okay, Fordham football season in the fall canceled because they're in the Patriot League. Everything else is in the Atlantic 10. What I wanted to know is what's going to happen with the basketball season in the Atlantic 10. I mean, that's what the Atlantic 10 is. It's a basketball.
Right.
And, it was interesting because the Atlantic 10 has already had conversations and put measures in place for the fall and for the spring. They're going to regionalize the travel, no air travel. There's a lot of travel restrictions to combat the concerns about the coronavirus. And he said, and I'm sure this isn't 100% true, how he said it to me was they haven't discussed the winter sports season in the Atlantic 10. I'm sure they've discussed it, but nothing they're willing to share yet. They still have time on their side. It's kind of a wait and see. They're going to wait as long as they can before they have to make any decisions regarding the basketball season. But that's the A-10's bread and butter. That's really the NCAA's bread and butter is the basketball season. So that was the answer that I wanted to get. What is the deal with basketball? And as of now, for the Atlantic 10 basketball, they're planning on it going on as it normally would.
And Pat, as much as we all want college athletics to come back, I think we can also agree that we want these players to be properly compensated for their time in college. And I wonder if before a spring season potentially begins, do you think that the NCAA will address the Pay for Play Act that California had introduced last fall? Do you believe that we'll see something come into play where college athletes will be compensated before the beginning of this spring season? Or do you think that's something that may happen down the line, probably later on in 2021?
It's hard to imagine that this is something that's going to be addressed before the spring, just because there's so much other stuff that the NCAA has to deal with. And if you've noticed, the NCAA hasn't said anything. Ivy League cancels its season, crickets from the NCAA. Patriot League cancels its season. We haven't heard anything. Obviously, everybody wants to know what about, the individual conferences are making the calls. We saw at the Big Ten, they're doing conference only. What about the Pac-12? What about the SEC? Everybody's waiting to hear on this. Nothing from the NCAA, because they know regarding football, they don't really have any power over these conferences. All the power is within the conferences. But look at all the factors now facing the NCAA. First of all, you want to get these guys back on the field, guys and girls back on the field. You want to get them back on the field healthy and competing again. You have the social justice issues. You have a lot of colleges in the south of our country still with statues and monuments on these campuses, paying homage to slave owners and other names throughout history that history does not, and rightfully so, look kind upon right now. So you have issues where athletes don't want to play kind of under that umbrella on their specific campuses. So that's another issue. What about the eligibility issue? Last spring, when the spring sports season was canceled, they allowed spring athletes an extra year of eligibility. Well, now what are you going to do with fall athletes if this season is canceled? And you have to wait and see, because what if some conferences are like the Patriot League and the Ivy League are going to have a season in the spring, but others are not? And the problem here is who on this call, and raise your hand, has confidence that the NCAA can handle all of this in a clear, concise, and common sense-like manner? I certainly don't. I don't see any hands.
No one on this call. And certainly, Pat, our jobs have changed a bit. A year ago today, we might have been talking about what Pete Alonso did last night, but our conversations are very different. And we thank you for contextualizing everything. Thanks for coming on and helping us look at everything. Pat O'Keefe of News 12. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Pat.